Good morning, friends of the Museum of South Texas History. My name is Francisco Guajardo. I am the Chief Executive Officer of the museum. And welcome to a new year. So as we embark upon 2023, we have some very exciting programming through Museum Pláticas. And so welcome to Museum Pláticas, the inaugural show of the year 2023. What we want to do today is commemorate and reflect, and in some ways also celebrate the life and impact of Reverend and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And so as some of you may know, yesterday marked his birthday. He was born on the 15th day of January in 1929. And as you probably know as well, that there is a federal holiday. We have a national holiday to commemorate the impact in the life of Dr. King. And so as a history museum, we would like to think about the impact of Dr. King and his movement, the civil rights movement. He was part of a much bigger movement, of course. It wasn't just the King movement. But it's a rich part of American history that to this day resonates in very clear and loud ways, his impact. And so today we're going to start with a conversation on Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. We're going to do that with a scholar who works at the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley. And so I'm going to introduce you to her. And we may have another guest for the third segment of the program. But for this introductory segment, I will say to you to stay with us. And when we come back from our commercial break, we'll be joined by a political scientist. And so I'll tell you who she is when we come back. Stay with us. Okay, welcome back to Museum Pláticas, friends of the Museum of South Texas History. So I am super excited today because we have a guest from the university who's a political scientist. Her name's Natasha. She has a middle name, I think. Ernst, I think you said. And Altema and McNeely. So McNeely is your family name, yes?
Altema is my family name.
Altema is your family name?
Yeah, McNeely is my married name.
Okay, good. So Natasha, tell us a little bit about yourself, because the audience, the museum audience may not know you. And so if you can just tell us, where are you from? How did you get here? What do you do?
Okay, I am an associate professor in political science at the university. I joined UTPA in 2013. Originally, I'm from Georgia. I grew up in Georgia. I went to Iowa for graduate school, and then I came to UTPA for my job.
when you and I had a conversation earlier, you traced a little bit of your genealogy. You said that your parents are immigrants from Haiti.
Yes.
And so tell us a little bit about who your parents are and when they would have come from Haiti and why they would have come from Haiti and where they went.
Sure. So my parents are they immigrated from Haiti to New York. Dad came in the late 60s. My mom came in the early 70s, and they met and they fell in love. and then history went on from there. But some of the reasons why they came was they're both respectively, they had members of their family come to the United States first and then send back for the rest of their respective families. And that's the trajectory of much of the Haitian diaspora, if you will.
Are your parents watching us?
They might be.
They might. They might. So I'm gonna say to your father and to your mother that if they're watching, to send us a little comment, and then hopefully they won't be too provocative. and so I think you said that your mother is a semi-retired educator.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. She actually inspired me to become a university professor. At first, I thought I would be a lawyer, but then I reflected on the impact my mom had on her students, ranging from pre-K students all the way through college students, and realized that I could make a better difference in the classroom than I would in the courtroom.
So your mother then has taught very young children, and she's also taught full-grown people.
Yes.
So is she now teaching in higher education, or?
Yes. She took a break during the pandemic, but I think she'd like to go back part-time.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, that's interesting. So is Altema, is it Spanish, French, a combination of the two? What's the Haitian influence in that?
So it's tough to say. I know that there are European elements of my family on both sides. I'm not entirely sure where from, because it could be French, it could be other countries that had come through Haiti. But from what my dad told me on his side, my grandpa's original name was Altemar, so Altemar. But when he arrived to Ellis Island, they shortened it to Altema. And so it just kind of followed the family.
Okay, so the family did come through Ellis Island.
I believe so, yes.
Okay, at some point. Okay.
Yeah.
All right, so then you grew up in Georgia.
Yes.
You were born in Long Island or somewhere, you said?
Yes.
And then you came to Georgia when you were about 6 years old. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so you would grow up in the Atlanta area.
Mm-hmm. Right about 45 minutes away in what many call a suburb. The city's called Roswell.
Mm-hmm. And so when you grew up there, you must have been imbued with the whole kind of mystique of Martin Luther King Jr.
Yes.
Yeah. So talk about what that would have been like as a child. Kind of like understanding life, understanding community,
Sure.
understanding the country and the world.
Sure. So as immigrants in Haiti, where, of course, as much of the rest of the Caribbean and Latin America, race is tied to class, but then one's class status is also tied to their skin tone. So upon arrival to the United States, my parents realized and had to learn the hard way that America's form of racism is different. And so they really made it a point when I was growing up to have me understand what racism and various forms of discrimination entailed. So I remember watching episodes of Eyes on the Prize, and then of course they taught me about Martin Luther King. And since we lived very close to Atlanta, where he was born, we would take family members who visited from out of state to see, Ebenezer Baptist Church. We saw his birth home. And so as I've grown older, I've become more familiar with his teachings. And so that's really thanks to my parents, who again wanted me to have that understanding of this is how America views you. This is how America views us.
So I wonder, Natasha, if we can jump to the present, and then I'd like to trace what the present, how it's been shaped, because you made a reference to the Ebenezer Baptist Church. And so my inclination is to go there, right?
Okay.
So why Ebenezer Baptist Church? And so there's clearly a reason for it. But I also want to, have this conversation with our audience and really tell our audience this is why we're here today, right? Ebenezer has something to do with it, but how people understand it today is that, so we today are commemorating a holiday that honors a person who would have been born, Michael King.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And then his father changed his name from Michael to Martin Luther because he was so inspired
Right.
by the historic
Right.
Martin Luther.
Right.
And so then he would come of age, the boy, Martin Luther King Jr., and he would be of such consequence that the federal government would create a national holiday. What does the holiday mean in general? Why the holiday?
Well, it's a great question, right? Because I think MLK Junior Day means a lot to many people, right? I think people who are less familiar recognize it as a day off from school or work. But I think for those who are more familiar with him, that it's a day of remembrance. So like here in the Rio Grande Valley, I know the university and various local organizations have a day of service because that was a huge part of who he was. And that was a huge part of how he intended to change the world through nonviolence and through a reminder of continuous service, especially to those who were of need and who had less. And so I think that's a big part of why the holiday is so impactful for people, because it's not only a memory of his legacy and what he accomplished and what he continues to do, but it's also a reminder to all of us to give back and to continue to serve.
So the idea of service, he spoke about service often. And he used to talk about how if you want to be great, that anybody who does service is great. So if you do service, you can be great. And so he was so like lofty with his rhetoric, with everything he said almost. But service is also part of how this kind of negotiation to convince people that this can be a holiday. Is sort of framing it around service. It makes complete sense, but it's also political in some ways.
Sure.
It's palatable
Right.
to frame it around service rather than to frame it, say, around the issue of social justice.
Sure.
Or social justice is acceptable,
Right.
but racial justice,
Right.
you begin to get into more kind of like murky terrain.
Sure.
But service, right? And it seems that even though he didn't live a long life, the life that he lived was full.
Very.
And it was full
Right.
of service.
Yes.
What kind of service?
Well, as a preacher, he spoke a lot of serving others, serving the community through his speech writing, through his speeches that he gave. It was a reminder of those to help, right? To help those around you, not only to help yourself, but to help those in your community, to help those who didn't have access to various resources, or even to help by gaining access to those resources as a community by working together. So a way to get to your goal is by helping each other out and not only become a community, but to have that community become stronger together. That through these goals, or in order to achieve those goals, it's by working together.
Was there something different about his service? So let me like explain a little bit where I think I want to come from. Like, I can provide service. Like I can go to help a nonprofit or help, somebody who needs. But MLK seemed to do like the most radical service. It wasn't just service. It was like, putting his life on the line
Absolutely.
to change structures that
Absolutely.
were not fair to people.
Right.
What was his service about? And if you can maybe share a story or two about that kind of service.
Sure. So the element of service you describe is very important as well, because as you imply in your answer, like ultimately he made the ultimate sacrifice. But even before then, he ended up in jail. He and his allies and supporters, they ended up brutalized by the police, right? So that's also an act of service, because one of their goals, right, was social justice, to end class inequality, to end racial inequality. And so the way that they sought to do that is by putting themselves in harm's way, where they would face basically physical barriers, right, by local governments, by federal governments, depending on the area that we're looking at. And a lot of those physical barriers consisted of brutal violence. And so, as you were rightfully pointing out, that form of service was especially impactful because they really did put themselves on the line. Ultimately, he was assassinated, but during those times, during those various nonviolent demonstrations or attempts to get to places, many people died, many people were hurt. He was jailed and brutalized himself. His wife was as well. So that is also the willingness to face danger, the willingness to, and knowing likely that one could get killed or one could be violently brutalized, but willing to do it anyway because what it would result in would better the community, not just the African American community, but the entire country, right? That is also an act of service as well.
So let's trace it then a little bit, see if we can. So this is somebody who's born in 1929, and his grandparents, may have been slaves and were sharecroppers. And so he's born into a family where his father was a preacher. And he was actually the minister at the Ebenezer Baptist Church,
I believe, yes.
in Atlanta.
Yep.
Yes.
Yep.
And so he would grow up not a poor child.
Right.
I mean, he was like kind of a middle class upbringing.
Yes, it was.
And in school, he was kind of an okay student. He didn't necessarily excel in school, but he did enough to get by. He graduated from high school when he was 15 years old or something, right? And then he went to a college called Morehouse.
Yes.
Yeah. So why do you think he would have picked Morehouse?
Well, Morehouse and the sister college, Spelman, are both they historically were founded to be all black male schools with Morehouse and all black female schools with Spelman. And they were quite renowned. And of course, during the era of his upbringing and his education, there continued to be racial segregation. And so it was very difficult, if not impossible, for African American students to attend, let's say the University of Georgia was not admitting, African American students at that time. So having Morehouse, having Spelman in the Atlanta area historically was and continues to be a place where parents knew their children would not only get an education, an excellent education, but they would also be in a safe space.
And so I think it was at Morehouse, my memory, that where he picked up Thoreau. And he must have been about 18 years old maybe. And he read Henry David Thoreau and what Thoreau wrote about specific to protest, nonviolent protest. So what would that have been like? I mean, your understanding of how King was influenced.
Sure. And later on he would be influenced by Gandhi as well. And with both of those philosophies and having experienced life as he saw it, right, that it would have been very impactful to read these works that said civil disobedience is quite important, but one can achieve one's goals not through violence, but through nonviolent means.
So it was a civil disobedience,
Yes.
kind of like emphasis of Thoreau.
Yes.
And it was a civil disobedience emphasis of Gandhi, who he was paying close attention to.
Yes. Yes.
King was.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
In his efforts to help liberate India.
And so he graduated from Morehouse, and he would go up to Philadelphia to study, like do a master's degree, I think, in divinity or something, right? And he would do well there. And then would go to Boston University to do a doctoral degree in divinity. And he was young, like maybe 25, 26 when he graduated,
Yes.
or when he finished his dissertation.
Right.
and he would meet a girl there in Boston, a music student.
Mm-hmm.
And so, what do you know about Coretta?
From what, and honestly, I have to admit that I need to learn more about Coretta, but from what I do know, that she had a beautiful voice, but she had a very formidable personality, which made her a very great match for Dr. King.
So they married, and then they would come down to the South, where he would, I think, get his own church in Montgomery, Alabama. And then something happened, right? So this would have been December 55,
Yes.
which really changes everything.
Yes.
It changes the world,
Right.
you know,
Right.
kind of like from a macro perspective. But this is the time that Dr. King is thrust into a position that he didn't ask for.
Right, very reluctantly.
Yeah. So tell that story, what happens in December of 1955.
The events that led up to the Montgomery bus boycott. So, from my understanding, aside from Rosa Parks, there was another African American female who had also refused to give up her seat, despite being commanded to do so. But the incident that received a lot of public attention was similar, and it involved Rosa Parks. And through her protests, in addition to her peers' protests, we see that there was a call to boycott. And as you rightfully pointed out, Dr. King was very reluctant to be the face of that boycott or to be on the forefront. But he accepted the mantle as part of the service, as part of his call to service, right? And they started the protest.
Which lasted a while,
Yes.
all the way into 1956.
Yes.
And so this is when they hold the very first service, like days after, maybe the day after, Rosa Parks was sent to jail because she refused to sit in the back of the bus.
Right.
And so you're right. It was Rosa Parks because the teenager who refused to sit in the back, sometime before, was not the right kind of
Right.
person,
Right.
Around
Right.
which a whole campaign could be,
Right.
sort of built.
And then you say it's because of her skin tone, because the late Rosa Parks was lighter skinned. Right.
There's a lot of stuff that's involved in this. Even like the organization sort of that was curating this
Right.
story, essentially.
Right.
What the organization was not curating, though, was who would lead this. And this is where, like, this historical happenstance takes place, right? When they say you're trying to figure out, okay, who's gonna be the voice,
Right.
and they say you,
Absolutely.
and they say that to Martin,
Yes.
and he's like, what? I think he said something like, if you will have me, or if
Yes.
I can be of service, I will
Yes.
do it.
Yeah.
And then he gives the very first, I guess, like, service, right? And in his sermon, this is early December of 55, people just go crazy. And his rhetoric is so soaring and so captivating and so on point,
Right.
not only for the moment,
Right.
but also for a much bigger struggle. And then he just takes off.
Yes. Very reluctantly, but
Very reluctant. And so is the story of Montgomery a story of how it was, people power and organization and nonviolent protest? Is it a story of that, and how this emergence of a young Baptist preacher, is it the story of that, or is it a story of that plus like the judicial system working as well?
Well, I think the first part that you highlighted is the integral part of the story, because that's what leads these political institutions to actually act, right? And so we see it as the civil rights movement continues. For example, with Dr. King's efforts to get the Civil Rights Act of 1964 passed, and then continuing to push to get the Voting Rights Act of 1965 passed. It's the people power behind it is what led the institutions to finally act, and then to keep acting, if you will, right? So I think you're right that it's more than just the people power, but the people power, like this grassroots bottom up movement and continuous movement and continuous call to action is what actually led to meaningful action.
There had been brutalities before. There had been lynchings. There had been just homicides of people that were so brutal. But in none of those cases was the imagination of the country or the world captivated as when Dr. King stepped in to help people make sense of it. There's something about him and his rhetorical prowess. Can you place that in some sort of historical context? Because it wasn't happening before, and things were happening.
Right.
People were active. People were protesting. People were doing all kinds of things.
Right.
But there was something about the moment and the man.
So I think for the audience, I think it's also important to remember that Dr. King, as you rightfully talked about, was able, through his speeches and through his letter writing, was able to articulate and really reinforce the need for people to know what was happening. But I think also another integral part of the civil rights movement, which he talked about, right, was the murder of Emmett Till and the efforts of his mother to have the world see what they did to her son. And I think that also really was impactful for the movement, for the civil rights movement, because, with her push to have an open casket, despite the condition of Emmett's body, you physically saw what happened and physically heard and had to really internalize what happened. And then I think that also really helped Dr. King in the descriptions of those and as you said, all those brutal incidents, and Dr. King talking about it and calling for action and saying we need to do more. We're better than this. Those moments were also impactful, in addition to his very powerful oratory skills.
So in some ways, he's able to help people feel the brutality that was taking place, whereas others maybe would have seen a photograph and have been horrified. He would have shown you the photograph and given you the words so that you could feel it more, internalize it more, and was very strategic himself, wasn't he, with it? I mean, the whole movement. When you read about the trajectory after Montgomery, it was a while before they had another victory. They tried Albany. That was disastrous because the sheriff there had studied King and he said, they're going to be nonviolent. I'm going to be nonviolent. I'm going to take you to jail anyway, but I'm not doing dogs. I'm not doing hoses. So, that was a failure. But then he found Birmingham. No, what was it? Birmingham, right?
Birmingham.
With Bull Connor.
Yes.
And that worked.
Yes.
Because he did sick the dogs on the protesters.
Right. And then there is also, in addition to, again, the institutional aspect, right? The media was present. And the media was present to send all these images of people being attacked by dogs and people being subjected to fire hoses as they're trying to cross the Pettus Bridge, right? That also, in addition to Dr. King's speeches, the images from the media, both of those really made an impact.
So this is an important point because television was just taking off.
Yes. Yeah.
Right? And so, in fact, a lot of these images are black and white images.
Yes.
So television wasn't even color.
Right.
So you see the emergence of television augmenting, enhancing the power of what MLK was bringing to really put meaning to the horrors that were happening. So civil disobedience through nonviolent protest becomes a hallmark of King. When others would have advocated say a Malcolm X or
Right.
somebody, right, would have advocated, hey, we have to stand up and we have to punch back.
Right.
But he never did.
He did not.
Why do you suppose?
His commitment to what he felt was the best strategy. So, and I think that commitment is especially powerful because, as he rightfully pointed out, there were losses, right? And there were moments when they didn't make progress, or maybe when progress even regressed, right? But he remained steadfast in his commitment to civil disobedience through nonviolent means.
And the movement stayed like that. So you look at some of his, top assistants. The Reverend Abernathy was always about that. And you look at other people like, say, A. Jesse Jackson was always like that.
John Lewis.
John Lewis. John Lewis, till the day he died,
Right.
was like that.
Right. Good trouble.
Good trouble, yeah. Wow. Andrew Young.
Yes.
Yes. There's so many people. What an impact. What an impact. And so we're going to take a little break, Natasha, and when we come back, I want to ask you about how that impact would have made its way into South Texas.
Perfect.
Okay? So thank you for this
Thank you.
terrific conversation. All right, so when we come back, we're going to shift gears and sort of move the geography to South Texas and how MLK would have affected where we live today. So stay with us. Okay, welcome back, friends of the Museum of South Texas History. This is Museum Pláticas, the January 2023 edition. And today we're having a conversation about the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., Dr. King. And so Natasha, what did you make of our conversation before we went on break? Because we were like trying to get into, King and the origins, talked a little bit about you, Montgomery, and, we haven't talked about big stuff as well, but what did you make of our conversation?
Oh, it was great, and I think it was a very nice primer for your audience in case they weren't familiar with who he was, and if they were only familiar with sort of like the bigger occasions in his life and within the movement.
Yeah, I worry about that because of, we have this national holiday, but maybe it's just something that people look forward to take the day off, say, for example. And so I worry about us doing that without having a sense for why and the meaning of it. He won the Nobel Prize in 1964.
He did. Yep.
Because of the movement he was leading. Yeah. Yeah. Right. I don't know if you want to reflect on that. I mean, because that was huge.
Right. If I'm not mistaken, I believe he was the first African American to receive it, if I'm not mistaken. And so it was huge for the community, but also huge for the civil rights movement, right? And as you had pointed out earlier, there were contemporaries of his who had advocated for different means of gaining and reaching their goals, and yet he remained very steadfast and committed to civil disobedience through nonviolent means, and globally it was recognized, right? But I think what is also not talked about often, but I think is still important to remember as we reflect on who he was as a person, is that 3 years later, as we're progressing down the timeline of his life, and that culminates with his assassination, there, despite winning the Nobel Peace Prize, he wasn't viewed as positively anymore by the time of his death. Yet, when he was assassinated, the reaction to his death was quite profound, right? So that led us into the various race riots in our nation's major cities that led to a recognition of his impact that continues on today, right? And I think that even though that's negative, I think it's still really important to remember, because then it gives us a better understanding of who he was and how some of his experiences, but also how he was viewed, very unjustly, of course, but it's also important for us to remember that as well.
So I'd like to just point out a couple things that I think everybody should know about Dr. King. One is what's most iconic about him, I think, is the speech that he gave at the National Mall in Washington. And so the March on Washington and what it means, because that's where he delivered his I Have a Dream speech that he had been practicing.
Right.
And I was talking to a friend, Sabrina, Sabrina, and so I said to Sabrina, I think that the King gave his talk there at Rocky Mount, where you from?
Yeah.
And she said, what? And so we started to talk about it. But, he was testing his material because he went to so many places. He gave so many talks. He gave so many interviews. He was on the road all the time. The March on Washington, though, and the speech in Washington is so iconic, and everybody needs to know about that. There's also a speech that he gave at Riverside Church in Manhattan, in New York, where the tide began to turn against him. And so I think it's just fair to note, because it is part of his own broader view of humanity. It is where he criticized the American government for participating in the Vietnam War.
Right.
And so this is where there would be a lot of disaffection, and people would, what? Like, we thought better of you.
Right.
But really, in the bigger scheme, that that history is now judging him differently from how he was being judged at that time. And so
Right.
when he's assassinated,
Right.
he didn't have a lot of people behind him like he did earlier.
Right.
But then the way people mourn and the way people remember would have changed a lot.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, Natasha, what does King have to do with South Texas? There's got to be some sort of through line here.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. So, in preparation for today, I found a couple of really fascinating things. So, one of the things that I was thinking to myself was, I wonder, as contemporaries, if Martin Luther King Jr. and Cesar Chavez had ever crossed paths. And although they never physically did, I did find a source that said that they had exchanged telegrams in the 60s, in the mid to late 60s, and one of which was from September 22nd, 1966, in which part of the message from Dr. King to Cesar Chavez was that, quote, our separate struggles are really one, a struggle for freedom, for dignity, and for humanity, end quote. And so that really shows that there is a mutual recognition between these two very, these two leaders who advocated for not only freedom against the struggle of their respective movements, but both of them also advocated for a civil disobedience through nonviolent means. And with Cesar Chavez, his impact with United Farm Workers and Dolores Huerta's continuous impact with UFW is very impactful for especially South Texas, right? As many people who were farm workers were part of the United Farm Workers movement.
And, Dolores Huerta, who you referenced, got beat up in at least one demonstration. She was in her 80s. She's now like 97.
She is.
And she's still dancing.
She's
doing
still
all kinds of
going,
fun
yes,
stuff.
yes.
But she was beaten up much like King was beaten up. And King's followers were beaten up oftentimes. There is a very interesting, very specific event in 1966 that just takes, the model from Selma to Montgomery and that march, done for civil disobedience, but peacefully, and just about everything that MLK Jr. did. But when in 1966, farm workers at Casita Farms in Rio Grande City protested and boycotted because the farmers wouldn't give them wages that they thought were, were just.
Right.
They decided to stage a march all the way from Stark County to the Capitol in Austin.
Wow.
Very reminiscent, of the height of the civil rights movement in the South.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And all done in the same way as well. It was through non-violent protest. Then there's also, Natasha, the student walkouts. All across South Texas. They happen in Kingsville. They happen in Etcalchosa, just down the road. Student walkouts that were done to resist what they thought was an unjust system. So it was civil disobedience through nonviolent protest. And as far as I know, all these student walkouts were nonviolent in South Texas. This kind of like through line
Right.
between what Reverend King was doing in the South and coming all the way to South Texas.
And there's another South Texas connection between Dr. King and this time with Crystal City, with Dr. Jose Angel Gutierrez and his co-founder Mario Campeon, who both have founded the La Raza Unida political party. And so I had, as part of my Texas politics class, I came across a video series from the late 80s called Chicano, the history of the Mexican American Civil Rights Movement. And one of the episodes talked about taking political power. There's another episode about the United Farm Workers Movement. And in the political power episode, they talked to Jose Angel Gutierrez and other early members of La Raza Unida. And during some of the video segments, Jose Angel Gutierrez mentioned that he and his colleagues were inspired by Cesar Chavez and Dr. King, and they read their works, they went to go hear them speak. And so, of course, Gutierrez took a slightly different path as part of La Raza Unida, but he was very much inspired with the civil disobedience and with the walkouts that happened in Crystal City and that were happening here in the Valley and in California during that time, as the students were fighting for like bilingual education, Mexican American studies, the ability to speak Spanish. And so all of that culminated also from being inspired by Dr. King. And for your viewers who don't know where Crystal City is, it's just south. If I read the map correctly, it's just south of San Antonio.
Right. No, I think that great observations there. So Crystal City is between kind of like Laredo and San Antonio, somewhere in the middle, in what they call the Winter Garden region. And I think Zavala County is where Crystal City is. You know, you mentioned Compián, Mario Compián and Jose Angel Gutierrez and a few other people. They did what John Lewis would have been doing with Dr. King, with like giving birth to young people being active in the movement. Like, John Lewis with SNCC, for example, there was a counterpart to that in South Texas. It was called Mayo, the Mexican American Youth Organization that Compián and Gutierrez founded when they were students at St. Mary's in San Antonio.
Right.
And they both had the same kind of. So remind me what SNCC stands for. It's a. Do you remember? So they led the student boycotts.
Right.
The sit-ins, right?
Right.
And so the student nonviolent. The committee, I think, SNCC. And so John Lewis became, like the symbolic kind of person there. Just like these guys over here with Mayo, they were also doing their own kind of boycotts through schools. So there's no question that South Texas, saw I think an influence of what Dr. King, and other people in the South began to stage as kind of a movement, beginning. I mean, it's hard to say that it started in 55, right? Because really this is like, none of this would have happened had people not done stuff in the 20s.
Right.
Not done stuff in the 18 whatever, right?
Right.
Had
Absolutely.
Frederick Douglass not spoken like he would, so this is kind of like the 20th century version of Frederick Douglass, Martin Luther King Jr.
Yes.
Right? Kind of like that.
Yes.
And in Haiti, Toussaint Louverture with, the independence movement. So that's an early day kind of apostle for freedom.
Right.
And so it goes back. But in the 20th century, what was happening in Montgomery, Alabama, that would just launch a whole movement and find a person.
Right.
Because isn't it funny how it's almost like this is driven by people?
Yes, absolutely.
But not just anybody can. It's like these people that history makes.
But I think that's a misperception, right? I think that's a misperception. And I think that for young people who might be listening today, who might think like, well, I don't know if I can do it. I think that it's important for them to realize that they can, because, as you said, history identifies who history thinks are important because of momentous occasions. But I think it's also who history forgets or ignores. They're also important too, just because maybe their impact wasn't as large. But it's everyday people who realize that injustice is happening, who take a chance and choose to fight it. Those are the people who turn into big movements, right? Cesar Chavez, Dolores Huerta, Dr. King. These were everyday people who were thrust into a leadership position that they then said, okay, there's a need, I'll do my best. And they made a large impact. But I think everyday people we have to remember that we can do something too. Our actions matter too, even if they might seem very small or insignificant.
And so maybe this is one of the reasons that service is such a good frame for this day, because service is something that is accessible to everybody. Yes. Everybody can do it.
Absolutely.
And then when a lot of people do it, I think, as you say, then everybody becomes important.
Yeah.
And I think Dr. King said that. You're important. You can be great if you do service. So, Natasha, what did we miss from our plática?
We covered a lot. I think we covered a lot.
But we must have missed something, no?
In regards to
and into Dr. King and Dr. King and just the meaning of and the day and all of that.
I guess I would do myself an injustice as a political scientist not to talk about some of the more meaningful laws that came as a result of his movement and the participation of everybody during the civil rights movement. So earlier I had mentioned the Civil Rights Act, which then led to the Voting Rights Act, and those really culminated from the continuous efforts, this bottom-up grassroots effort and continuous push to remind and to call for state governments, and especially the federal governments, because southern states weren't going to do it, but federal government to act and to really enforce the civil rights acts from the late 1860s. So the 13th, 14th, and especially the 15th Amendment, which said that nobody can be denied the right to vote based on race, but southern states were like, well, we're going to deny you based on race. And through this continuous bottom-up movement that really culminated in the civil rights movement, you got the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which wasn't strong enough. So Dr. King and everybody kept pushing and calling for more action. And that finally led to the Voting Rights Act, which continues to be impactful. It continues to be attacked to this day. But it not only was impactful for Blacks, but for, Asian communities, Hispanic communities. It continues to have an impact. Its legacy continues to be really important. And that was really thanks to Dr. King and his followers. Right?
And he never had like a party affiliation.
Right.
Like he was never with one party or the other party, and intentionally so.
Right.
I mean, he would call the federal government, hey, look, I'm in jail. Like Bobby Kennedy, I'm in jail, come do something, right? Sure. And so as they took him out of jail, they kind of wanted his endorsement.
Yes.
But he never endorsed.
No, and and as we were talking about earlier, towards the end of his life, he actually spoke out against the Johnson administration, which had signed this Civil Rights Act, which had signed the Voting Rights Act, which had, the fight against poverty and created Medicaid, strengthened Medicare, right? He said that you guys aren't doing enough. Like, these were great, but there's more to do. And so he really was more focused on the meaningful actions versus who was doing it. And I think that's really profound too.
Yeah. Wow. Well, thank you for being such a good political scientist.
Oh, thanks so much. Thank you.
Because you have to mention the legal apparatus, and how it was so affected by the movement. And I think you're right to say that it can never be safe because it's always being attacked.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, Natasha. Well, hey, listen, thank you so much for being part of our Plática this morning.
Thank you for the opportunity.
I hope that we've been useful in at least, some small way.
Absolutely.
To helping the community, and our friends understand a little bit more about what this day means and who we are remembering. So, thank you.
Thank you.
All right. So, when we come back, we're going to have another guest. So, her name is Sabrina Walker-Hernandez, and she's actually very involved with an organization that she's going to talk about when we come back. A very local organization that I think has a lot to do with this kind of legacy. All right. So thank you for joining us and stay with us. Welcome back to Museum Pláticas, friends of the Museum of South Texas History. Francisco Guajardo with you again. And so I'm joined by Sabrina. It's Sabrina Walker-Hernandez.
Yes.
Sabrina, what did you think of that plática we had, that Natasha and I had on MLK Day?
So, first of all, impressed by the knowledge that both of you have. And second of all, to go into the depths of which, to talk about a person who, like you said, in 13 years had such a profound impact. Talk about someone who came to this earth and served their purpose, their God-appointed purpose, and left such an impact and a legacy for generations to come. Beyond his life cycle is amazing. So, you know, I every time I talk to you and every time you're interacting and speaking, I learn something new. And so I'm always amazed at the conversations that you have with people and the knowledge that is in your head. And then you add Dr. Natasha, who's a specialist in what she does, who's an expert in what she does. And I'm sitting back going, I'm so happy I'm not a part of that conversation because I have nothing to contribute on that level. So
Well, she is really impressive.
Yes.
I was so taken by not only the life of Dr. King and how she makes sense of it through her study, but also how she was able to connect it to South Texas
Yes.
and what Dr. King's legacy and impact has to
Yes.
do with South Texas, and it's a lot.
Yes, and it's an impact of his legacy is actually felt around the world, and that's the part that really amazes me, in how one person can have such a ripple effect, not only on the generation in which he lived, but beyond that generation, and it continues to be felt throughout the world and throughout every place that I've ever lived knows of his legacy and it has somehow been impacted by his story.
When you were a kid growing up in North Carolina, did you feel that you were getting the story of Dr. King as you were coming up?
No, I actually learned from you that Dr. King spoke in Rocky Mount, North Carolina, in a place that we frequent a lot as children, because that's where they call it the OIC Center. And so that's where in the summer times we would go, or they had a school dance, they would hold it there. And I learned from you that that is one of the places in which he spoke. And that was never shared. And it's 2023. And it's still not something that's known in our community, because I got really excited and I text my mom and I talked to my sister and we had not heard of that. And so it's not something that's really highlighted. And it often makes me question why But growing up in the South, there's a lot of things that are not highlighted that would typically make someone feel proud of their ancestry. So,
Yeah. Yeah, Dr. King had a lot to say about that. He had a lot to say about, the ahistorical nature, in which we are raised.
Right.
And in fact, when Rosa Parks refused to go to the back of the bus, and King would provide the first sermon that was just like unbelievably uproarious and thunderclap, and it was just like a kinetic moment, like that took him aback. Like it's like
right.
what he did that one night was that he placed everything in historical context. So what he was doing was essentially popular education with the folks who were there at the church. And then like several thousand people outside the church who were listening, and who were reacting 2-3 seconds later. It was placing it in historical context.
Yes. And people want to know where they are in history. It lends some legitimacy to the struggle that you're experiencing, and that it hasn't always been struggle, right? And that you have contributed to society, and you have contributed to the community in a way that reflects pride. That's important to people, and I think that that's often overlooked, especially when we start talking about history and sharing those stories of minority stories in general, that they had a place in society. And our place did not start just with slavery, and our place did not just start from this sense of servitude. That is bigger than that. And I think that means a lot. I know it would mean a lot to me, having grown up in the South. I learned about the 13 colonies. I know all about Sir Walter Raleigh. And so I think that for him to voice that and put a voice to that and put it in that historical context was probably maybe one of the first times that they had heard that.
So what were you doing this morning?
So this morning I was representing a village in the valley and the Juneteenth Planning Committee for the city of Edinburgh, and we were cleaning Restlawn Cemetery, which is the historic Black cemetery in the valley, right here, located right here in Edinburgh, and a lot of people don't know about it. That one still amazes me. That cemetery has been around since 1928. 1928, I believe, is when, because, I mean, I'm talking to you, these things, but 1928, there was no place for African Americans to be buried, right? So they could be buried on private ranches, but there was no cemetery for them to be buried in. And I believe that Miss Baker, who was the maid to the owner of Hillcrest, convinced them, Hillcrest Funeral Memorial, to convince him to give like an acreage of land to the Black family so they would have somewhere to bury their dead. And so that cemetery has been there for a while, and initially it was overlooked. The thicket had grown, like you couldn't even get to it. Lewis Callis brought attention to it later in life, because if you're buried on a ranch or in that type of cemetery, you have to be responsible for your family's graves. So he would go and he would clean his family grave, and Valerie Ramirez, who would see him going and was wondering what he was doing, and she found out that there was this whole cemetery there. And so that was kind of like the catalyst for it to become like this community-wide project of clearing up that land and making sure that the graves were recognized and that they had markers and that the brush was cleared away. And so today I'm very proud to say, because of all the efforts that was started many moons ago, we had about 50 volunteers that were there, and we've painted the fence. And actually I want to give proper proper credit to Ronnie Rivera, who now owns Hillcrest Funeral Home. He's done some wonderful things there. He's replaced the fencing there. And so we were just able today to go in and just really touch up the crosses that are there. There's a lot of people that are buried that don't necessarily have markers, right? And so they put crosses. There was a project through the university that they were able to, through technology, modern day technology, determine that there was a body there, right? And so they put up crosses to represent that there is someone buried here. Some have headstones and some do not. And so today we spent time cleaning that up and, digging away the weeds and really putting the mulch down. And we were able to put flowers on the graves thanks to HEB. So everybody got fresh flowers on their graves. So it was really something that I enjoy doing. I think it's a service day, and bringing it back to MLK Day of service. Not as sacrificial as going to jail or anything like that, but it is a sacrifice that people give their time to go out and make sure that the people are remembered, and everybody wants to be remembered. And so that's how we, choose to honor and serve.
There was such a beautiful point that Natasha made about this very thing, about service and about how this is for everyone. And so the headlines might be gotten by those who, are sent to jail or whatever, but it is the rank and file of the people, who come and do stuff.
Yes.
That is what sustains the movement,
right,
or creates the change,
right,
or and
right.
So those understated and unknown people who are out there pulling out the weeds.
Yes, pulling out the weeds. And I think the more we come together in service is actually a huger reflection of once you come together in service, you start talking to people, you start to get to know people, you're working on a similar project. I think it lends to this greater concept of peace. I think we come together in service, but it lends to peace. And I think really when I think of Dr. King's legacy, I think of peace and that unity that he was inspiring to have fulfilled in his lifetime.
So for the record, I want to say that you are a trustee
Yes.
of the Museum of
Yes,
South
I
Texas
am.
History. So just want to make sure that
Yes.
people know.
Yes,
And so,
I am. I love history, so this is my jam. Just
So tell us a little bit, Sabrina, about Viva.
Okay, so Village in the Valley was started in 2019. And because, it's very interesting. Village in the Valley was started because I relocated to the Valley in 1992. And so when I relocated to the Valley, I literally thought that I was alone, right? And there's a lot of people that relocate to the Valley who think that there's not a lot of people who look like them, right? But not only that, not people to just look like them, it's also that maybe has some of those cultural identifiers. And so Village in the Valley was started so that we could get to learn other cultures, because there's a whole controversy around African American or Black, or and when you look at the Black population that is in the Valley, they're from Canada, they're from Nigeria, they're from Senegal, Gambia, so they're not African American, right? And so we just wanted a place where or entity that would elevate the Black voice in the Valley, while at the same time connecting other cultures. And so we come together socially every first Friday of the month for networking at España restaurant. Not only that, we participate in days like MLK Day of Service, Juneteenth, we put on a big program, and we come together to elevate that voice. But the social connection is really key too, and learning about other cultures is very key to what Village in the Valley is about. I have gotten to eat Nigerian food. I've gotten to eat, I'm a foodie. So I've gotten to eat Vietnamese food, learn about their cultures and connect Indian food. And so it really is about, the Valley is more diverse than we think. that has been the most eye-opening thing for me. There's a lot of people here, even on the Hispanic spectrum. I've learned about the Belizean culture. I've learned about the Honduras culture. I've learned about the Cuban culture, because once you get here, a lot of people just assume, because of how people look, that they're from the valley. And then you start talking to them and you're like, oh no, I'm Belizean. Oh no, I'm Honduran. Or, oh no, I'm from Colombia. And it's like, oh, I want to learn about your culture. And so we bring people together so that they can talk about their culture, and not only talk about their culture, so that those that want to learn about those cultures can also participate in that conversation and ask questions in a safe environment. So that's what I really enjoy about it.
The Pam and I, so Pam is behind, not the camera, that's Tony, but behind the computer. We submitted a grant last week to the National Endowment for the Humanities. Oh, by the way, I wanted to give a shout out to España, because that's owned by Isaac Guerra, who's another trustee.
Yes.
So thank you to Isaac
Yes.
for what he does for the museum. Good place to eat, by the way.
Yes, it is.
España, yes. And so our proposal is entitled, I think it's something like The Underground Railroad to South Texas.
Yes.
And so in our write-up, we do the setup to the narrative by talking about the 1747 shipwreck of a slave ship right off the Gulf of Mexico, where a number of the slaves survived.
Yes.
And they came inland, and they became part of the community.
Yes.
So 3 or 4 years later, when Escandon comes with his 400 plus people for the colonization of South Texas, they run across a bunch of people who look like they're black.
Yes.
And then there's like a lot of indigenous people as well.
Yes.
And they document that.
Yes. 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 It's always fascinating, and also the fact that and you correct me on my dates, because I'm a historian, but peripheral. Okay. So I always done a little research, and it's amazing to me, and I don't know where this conversation is going to go, but I've done the research that it's an assumption that the civil rights didn't impact the world. It was in America. So you have the blacks that are in Lima, you have the blacks that are in Mexico, you have the blacks that didn't have like a civil rights movement, right? And so I like to read Mexico, just in the past 10 years or so, changed their census to add black to the census. And a lot of people don't know that either. There was a ship, and you could probably give me more information on this, but in the town of Guerrero in Mexico.
The Guerrero?
Yes.
Guerrero? Yeah,
yes.
It's also coastal.
Yes, that large population of those residents are black people. It was a result of a slave ship that crashed there, and the people stayed, and they the intermingling, but they look like me, but they speak Spanish. And so just in the past 10 years, I know black has been put on the Mexico census. I think this world is just smaller than what people realize.
I mean, the African experience in Mexico is absolutely palpable, not only because of the slave trade that was for 3 centuries.
Right.
Mexico, by the way, abolished slavery way before the U.S. Yeah. And when Mexico fought for independence, part of what they wanted to do was to abolish slavery.
Yes.
And this is where, like, Stephen F. Austin wanted to come in, sort of became complex because he wanted to bring slaves in. Mexico was, no, we're not, we're trying to get rid of that.
Right.
And so, so the whole Texas revolt has that as a backdrop. But I think that Natasha said it earlier, I think, because she's from Haiti, which shares an island with the Dominican Republic. And so it's been that kind of tension as well.
Yes.
In Latin America, race is different than in the United States.
Yes.
In the United States, I mean, it has its own sort of racial history and culture and how it's built into the law.
Right.
Even in the Constitution.
Yes. Even
though it doesn't say slave, it's clear there's 3/5 of a person.
Yes.
And so it's sort of in the Constitution.
Right.
And in other places, I mean, even take Texas and how Texas became a country in 1836. Texas becomes, the Constitution of Texas says, we're doing slavery here.
Yeah.
And we're doing cotton here. And that becomes like the model for the Confederate Constitution.
So
And so how these people are sort of dealing with issues of race compared to, say, Mexico, and Mexico is a very different kind of reality
right.
constitutionally. But and so Natasha mentioned how, you know, I forget how she mentioned it exactly, and she's here, so she can probably tell us, but how, you know, the issue of race is treated differently in Latin America.
Yes, it is. Yeah.
So it's much more about a class system where skin color still is key. But in the United States, it's been skin color.
It's been skin color. And it's just amazing to me, just looking at it from a historical perspective of just the Black experience in Latin America, like even, you know, just to see. It's a twofold thing. It is class, but it's also, I think, the reflection of skin color is always going to kind of be with us. And I think that skin color conversation still happens in Mexico and still happens in other parts of the world as well. So.
Oh yeah, no. I mean, you know, it happens everywhere.
It happens in families.
It has been in families. Yes, it happens in families as well. Sure. Like in say the Mexican or Mexican American, you know, cultural tradition. If the child is born a little bit light skinned, es güerito.
Yes.
And that has meaning.
Right.
Even though people may not mean it consciously, they mean it subconsciously somehow.
That subconscious bias is there. It's there.
My father was, I don't know, maybe 15 years younger than his oldest sister. And so my father was the darker skinned of the children. And so in the family lore, they say how the older sisters didn't want to take my father into the town because he was dark skinned.
Yeah. It happens in families.
and they would tell that story and they would all laugh.
Yeah.
Yeah, when they were older.
Yeah. So I think, like I said, I think it's interesting, this dynamic of class and skin color and how it has impacted the world, you know? And so we still have a ways to go, but I think we've come a long way too.
Well, we can be having this conversation here at the Museum of South Texas History.
Right.
How about that?
Yeah. And I get to meet people like you and learn something every day. So I'm always appreciative.
Thank you, Sabrina, for coming and being part of this program today.
Thank you.
Appreciate everything you do.
Thank you.
All right, so this has been the January edition of Museum Pláticas. I'm not sure if we got into trouble more than we enlightened, but you know, we try to be helpful somehow.
Yes.
And so, friends of the museum, we will see you in February for our next Museum Plática. Thank you so much.